Today, we're diving deep into one of the most specific and honestly one of the strangest laws in the entire biblical text. It's from the book of Numbers, and it lays out this incredibly elaborate ritual. It was all designed to solve a really serious spiritual problem. So, what exactly was this problem, and why was the solution so bizarre? To really wrap our heads around this law, we've got to start with the why. What was it trying to solve? For the ancient Israelites, what was the absolute number one, most severe kind of ritual contamination a person could possibly experience? And the answer? It all comes down to a concept called ritual impurity. And it's so important to get this right. This has nothing to do with being physically dirty or needing a shower. Ritual impurity was a spiritual state. It meant you were temporarily cut off from the sacred. You couldn't enter the sanctuary, you couldn't join in community worship. For a little while, you were on the outside looking in. So here's our game plan for this explainer. First, we're going to dig into the problem of purity itself. Then, we'll meet the very unique animal at the center of the whole thing. We'll see how they crafted the purifying water, how it was used in a 7-day cleansing, and finally, we'll find out the steep price you'd pay for ignoring this law. All right, let's get right into it. The most potent, the most powerful source of ritual impurity, the one that required this whole complicated ceremony, was any kind of contact with death. If you look at the source text, in Numbers 19, it lays it all out. You became unclean if you touched a dead body, which makes sense. But it went way farther than that. Just being inside a tent where someone had died, that made you unclean. Finding a human bone out in a field or even just touching a grave. Yep, all of it put you in the same 7-day state of impurity. And this is where it gets really interesting, just how far this contamination could spread. The law actually says that any open container in that tent, like a jar without a lid on it, also became unclean. So you see, it wasn't just about personal contact, it was like this invisible spiritual contamination that seeped into a space, affecting people and their stuff. So you have this incredibly powerful spiritual problem. How in the world do you counteract it? Well, the solution had to be just as unique, and it all revolved around a very specific and probably very rare animal. The law was incredibly strict on this. It demanded a red heifer, that's a young female cow, that was absolutely 100% perfect. It couldn't have a single blemish or defect. And here's the kicker. It must have never been used for work. It could never have had a yoke put on it. This animal had to be completely pristine, totally untouched by the ordinary work of the world. But okay, let's say you actually find this perfect animal. That's just step one. The next phase was this whole elaborate ritual to turn it into a purifying agent, what the text actually calls the water of separation. The process itself was spelled out in incredible detail. First, they take the heifer outside the main camp and sacrifice it. The priest then takes some of the blood and sprinkles it 7 times in the direction of the Holy Tabernacle. After that, the entire animal is burned. And I mean everything, skin, flesh, blood, even the dung is burned to ash. Into that fire they threw 3 very symbolic items, some cedar wood, a hyssop branch, and some scarlet wool. And finally, a man who was ritually clean would come and gather up all the ashes. And those ashes, that was the magic ingredient. They were carefully collected, stored, and kept ready to be mixed with water to create the one and only thing that could act as an antidote to the impurity caused by death. But here's where this ritual gets really wild. Kind of mind-bending, really. Think about this. The very people who were creating this ultimate purifier became impure by doing it. The priest who supervised, the guy who burned the heifer, and the man who gathered the ashes, every single one of them became ritually unclean until evening. The cure literally made the healers temporarily unclean. Okay, so they've got the ashes, they've got this secret sauce. How did they actually use it to cleanse someone who'd come into contact with death? Well, the application was, you guessed it, super specific. A ritually clean person would take just a little bit of the ashes and mix them into fresh running water. Then they would take a hyssop branch, remember that same plant they threw on the fire? Dip it in the ash water and sprinkle it on the unclean person and their stuff. And listen, this wasn't an instant fix. It was a full week-long process. The person was sprinkled with this water on the 3rd day, and they were still impure. Then they were sprinkled again on the 7th day. On that final day, they also had to wash all their clothes and bathe.
Only then, once the sun went down on day 7, were they finally considered ritually clean and able to rejoin the community.
So you can probably tell this wasn't some minor suggestion. This was a huge deal. And ignoring this process, well, that came with the most severe consequence you can possibly imagine.
So that raises the question, right? What happens if a person becomes unclean and just doesn't do it? What if they just decide to ignore the whole 7-day ritual and carry on as if nothing happened?
The text is brutally clear on this one. For an unpurified person who dares to enter the sacred space, it says they have defiled the sanctuary of the Lord. And for that, that soul shall be cut off from among the congregation.
And let's be clear, being cut off wasn't like getting a fine or a slap on the wrist. This was exile, complete and total excommunication. By refusing to be purified, a person was seen as a direct threat to the holiness of the entire community's sacred space. The punishment really was a kind of social and spiritual death. Ultimately, when you step back and look at the whole thing, you see this powerful symbolic logic at play. The profound impurity that comes from death required an antidote from a source of perfect, unblemished life, the red heifer. Its entire existence was transformed into the one thing that could reverse the spiritual contamination of mortality.
Which kind of leaves us with a big question, doesn't it? Is this just a complex ritual for a problem we don't even think about anymore? Or is it maybe a timeless window showing us how we've always, as humans, tried to find ways to deal with the unsettling reality of death and create a path back to life and community?